February 26, 1945. The sun claws its way over Iwo Jima's volcanic shoreline, revealing beaches the color of charcoal. In Private Wilson Watson's hand sits a 20-pound Browning automatic rifle, the weapon every Marine cursed under his breath. The brass called it unwieldy, too massive for the rapid, violent firefights that defined combat in the Pacific. Military thinking had calcified around a single belief. Full auto rifles belonged anchored to the ground, not slung across the backs of men advancing under fire. Japan's commanders had built their entire island fortress on this American orthodoxy. They'd equipped their troops with featherweight machine guns, trained them for lightning strikes and vanishing acts, tactics designed to shred any soldier crazy enough to haul automatic firepower across exposed terrain. As Watson's feet meet the sulfur-choked sand, the enemy has no comprehension of what's coming for them. In a quarter-hour bloodbath on one godforsaken hill, this condemned weapon will shatter every assumption the military clings to about automatic fire one Marine. 60 Japanese soldiers, a rifle the experts wanted retired. They had no idea. John Moses Browning conceived the Browning automatic rifle in 1918 during the closing heartbeats of a war that ended before his creation could prove its worth. Nearly 3 decades later, as the 3rd Marine Division steeled itself for what history would remember as the Corps' bloodiest confrontation, that same rifle weighed heavy in the grip of men who doubted it belonged anywhere near a modern battlefield. Private Wilson Watson had hauled the bar through 8 grueling months of preparation, from Parris Island's swamps to Pendleton's dusty ranges. Every mile reinforced the universal Marine wisdom. This gun was punishment incarnate. 20 pounds when fully loaded meant carrying double the weight of a standard M1. Garand Japanese infantry glided through jungle and coral with their lightweight Nambu machine guns and Type 99 rifles, while American riflemen groaned beneath a weapon that seemed engineered for some alternate reality of warfare. The numbers told part of the story, but not the brutal truth. The bar spat the same .30-06 rounds as the Garand, cycling at 500 to 650 rounds per minute on full automatic. Its effective range stretched to 600 yards, impressive in theory. But the 20-round magazine drained itself in under 2 seconds of sustained fire. Reloading under incoming fire ate 8 to 12 seconds, an eternity measured in enemy bullets. The bipod legs, supposedly there for stability, snagged on everything from jungle vines to jagged coral. Most Marines tore them off entirely, trading precision for the ability to actually move. Watson had internalized these deficiencies through months of repetition raised in rural Alabama. He understood tools and accuracy in ways his city-bred counterparts couldn't. His father had schooled him on a Springfield bolt action, preaching patience and shot discipline over volume. The bar embodied everything his upbringing had taught him to reject: waste, imprecision, dependence on machinery instead of skill. Yet here he crouched in the pre-dawn blackness of February 26th, watching Iwo Jima's silhouette swell as their landing craft churned through Pacific waters. Intelligence briefings had sketched a fortress unlike anything 3 years of island hopping had prepared them for. The Japanese had abandoned their previous approach of contesting beach landings. Instead, 8 months of preparation had transformed Iwo Jima's 8 square miles into a subterranean labyrinth. Interconnected tunnels, reinforced bunkers, and firing positions layered throughout the volcanic rock. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Denig had walked Watson's battalion through the enemy's defensive philosophy during their final briefing aboard the transport. The Japanese commander, General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had studied American amphibious doctrine and concluded that traditional banzai charges were suicide against superior firepower. His 21,000 defenders would fight from entrenched positions, compelling Marines to extract them one fortification at a time. Every slope, every gully, every seemingly innocent stretch of ground had been pre-registered for artillery and mortar strikes. The tactical challenge was unprecedented. Previous Pacific victories had come through rapid momentum backed by naval bombardment and close air support. Iwo Jima's defenders had burrowed too deep for naval shells to reach effectively. The volcanic terrain absorbed explosive force, transforming massive barrages into expensive fireworks displays that left the enemy infrastructure largely untouched. Victory would demand infantry work, small teams advancing under fire, neutralizing positions with grenades, flamethrowers, and direct assault. Watson grasped something his commanders missed. The BAR's battlefield reputation stemmed from misuse, not design flaws. Military doctrine envisioned the weapon as squad support, operated from stationary positions to provide covering fire for advancing riflemen. They'd imported this concept from European warfare, where machine gun nests dominated no man's land and infantry advances occurred across relatively open ground. The Pacific demanded different thinking. Japanese positions often sat yards apart, concealed in jungle or coral formations, requiring constant movement while maintaining sustained fire. As their landing craft neared the beach, Watson performed his final ammunition check. Standard operating procedure called for the bar operator to carry 12 20-round magazines, 240 rounds total. The ammunition alone weighed nearly 15 pounds, added to the weapon's 20 pounds, and his standard infantry gear. Other squad members carried 8-round clips that weighed a fraction of his burden. They could sprint between positions, drop prone for accurate shots, and maneuver without the constant mental arithmetic of ammunition conservation that governed Watson's every decision. The beach ahead looked deceptively calm. Naval bombardment had transformed the black volcanic sand into a moonscape of craters and wreckage, but no enemy fire greeted the initial landing craft waves. Intelligence had predicted this. Kuribayashi's strategy mandated allowing Marines to establish beachhead strength before triggering the defensive response. Somewhere in the hills overlooking the landing zone, Japanese observers were tallying boats and calculating American numbers. The genuine battle would ignite once Marines pushed inland. Watson's squad leader, Sergeant McMahon, had spent the voyage analyzing aerial reconnaissance photographs of their target. Hill 203 dominated the southern approach, its slopes riddled with caves and bunkers commanding firing lanes across the entire beachhead. Earlier battles had taught Marines that seizing high ground was essential for establishing secure footholds. But Iwo Jima's defenders had weaponized that principle. Every hilltop was a fortress engineered to funnel American attacks into prepared killing zones. The gap between doctrine and reality had crystallized during Hawaiian training exercises. Squad tactics prescribed the bar operator establishing a base of fire while riflemen advanced by bounds. But Pacific terrain rarely offered the clear sightlines that made this effective combat. Typically erupted at ranges measured in yards, not hundreds. The enemy materialized suddenly from hidden positions, engaged briefly at point-blank range, then vanished into tunnel networks connecting defensive positions across the battlefield. Watson had begun suspecting that his weapon's alleged weaknesses might transform into advantages under these conditions. The BAR's weight provided stability for rapid fire without needing a bipod. Its powerful cartridge retained effectiveness at close quarters even when fired from unstable positions. Most crucially, its automatic capability could deliver overwhelming firepower during the brief windows when Japanese defenders exposed themselves. As the landing craft's bow gate crashed down and Watson stepped into Iwo Jima's surf, he carried more than just a controversial weapon. He bore the weight of tactical assumptions that had governed American infantry doctrine since World War I. Within hours, those assumptions would face their ultimate test against an enemy who'd spent months preparing for precisely this moment. The too-heavy gun that military planners had begun retiring from infantry units was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most derided tools become the most decisive when wielded by someone who grasped their true potential. The illusion lasted exactly 47 minutes. Watson's boots had barely dried when the first mortar rounds began dropping among Marines scattered across the black sand. The enemy had waited with disciplined patience, allowing 4,000 Americans to cluster on the narrow beachhead before revealing the killing field they'd constructed. What unfolded wasn't a battle in any traditional sense.
It was methodical slaughter of men caught in an invisible web of interlocking fire. Watson's platoon had pushed 300 yards inland when the hillsides exploded with muzzle flashes. Japanese positions that aerial reconnaissance had overlooked or dismissed as neutralized revealed themselves through curtains of fire sweeping the volcanic terrain like deadly rain. The Marines had walked into a trap designed by an enemy who understood their tactics better than they understood themselves. Every piece of cover the Americans sought had been pre-registered for mortar fire. Every advance route channeled them toward machine gun positions hidden in caves and bunkers that naval bombardment couldn't reach. The sound differed from anything Watson had experienced in training. Japanese machine guns chattered with a distinctive rapid-fire rhythm, unlike the slower, heavier pulse of American weapons. The Nambu Type 92 fired 7.7mm rounds at 450 rounds per minute, creating a sustained buzz that mixed with rifle cracks and the deeper thump of mortars. But the silence between bursts proved most terrifying, moments when Marines realized movement meant death and stillness meant eventual death from indirect fire. Sergeant McMahon's voice cut through the chaos, directing his squad toward a depression in the volcanic rock offering momentary shelter. Watson followed, the bar's weight shifting awkwardly as he scrambled across terrain seemingly designed to punish anyone carrying more than basic equipment. Around him, Marines with lighter weapons moved more quickly, diving for cover that often proved illusory when enemy fire came from unexpected angles. The Japanese had positioned their weapons to create crossfires that eliminated dead space and forced attackers into increasingly desperate situations. The tactical problem crystallized within minutes. Traditional squad tactics relied on establishing suppressive fire to pin enemy positions, while other elements maneuvered for assault, but the enemy remained invisible, firing from positions impossible to identify until muzzle flashes gave them away. When Marines attempted returning fire, they exposed themselves to observers who directed mortar fire with lethal precision. The result was a deadly game of hide-and-seek where the Japanese held every advantage. Watson's first engagement lasted under 30 seconds but taught him everything he needed to know about his weapon's potential. A Japanese machine gun position opened up from a cave mouth approximately 60 yards to his front, tracers seeking targets among scattered Marines. Following doctrine, Watson deployed the bar's bipod and attempted returning precise fire from prone position. The weapon's accuracy was excellent, but his position immediately drew mortar attention. 3 rounds landed within 20 yards, forcing him to abandon his carefully prepared firing position and seek new cover. The lesson was immediate and brutal. The bar's conventional role as squad support weapon wasn't just ineffective, it was potentially suicidal against an enemy who'd spent months preparing for exactly these tactics. Watson realized his weapon's supposed disadvantages, its weight, its requirement for close-range engagement, its ammunition consumption, were actually adaptations to a different kind of warfare than military planners had envisioned. Private McMahon, crouched 10 yards to Watson's left, had burned through 2 8-round Garand clips trying to locate the machine gun position. His accurate rifle fire, devastating at longer ranges, proved inadequate against an enemy who appeared briefly before disappearing into prepared positions. The Japanese had learned to minimize exposure time, firing short bursts before withdrawing into tunnels connecting their defensive positions. Conventional marksmanship skills, the foundation of Marine training, became less relevant when targets appeared for seconds at a time. The breakthrough arrived when Watson abandoned doctrinal thinking and began treating his weapon as a close assault tool rather than support weapon. When the Japanese machine gun resumed firing, Watson left his covered position and began moving directly toward the enemy. The bar's 20-pound weight, previously a hindrance, now provided stability for accurate fire while advancing. Its automatic capability allowed him to maintain suppressive fire without the pause required for bolt manipulation. Most importantly, its powerful .30-06 cartridge retained lethal effectiveness at the close ranges where Pacific combat actually occurred. Watson's advance covered 40 yards in under 20 seconds, the bar firing in controlled bursts that kept the enemy position suppressed while he closed distance. The Japanese crew, trained to engage targets at longer ranges, found themselves facing sustained automatic fire from an increasingly close opponent. Their tactical doctrine hadn't anticipated an enemy who would advance directly into their field of fire while maintaining effective return fire. When Watson reached effective range, approximately 20 yards from the cave mouth, he emptied an entire magazine into the position in one sustained burst. The psychological impact on nearby Marines was immediate. They'd witnessed one man with an automatic weapon neutralize a position that had pinned down an entire squad. More importantly, they'd seen a tactical approach that matched the reality of Pacific combat rather than theories developed in peacetime training. The bar, dismissed as too cumbersome for mobile warfare, had proven decisive when employed aggressively at close range. But Watson's success came at a cost, illustrating the weapon's fundamental challenge. His 20-round magazine emptied in one engagement represented more than 8% of his total ammunition load. Conventional rifle fire allowed for precise ammunition conservation. With each shot carefully aimed and accounted for, automatic fire demanded different calculations, trading ammunition efficiency for tactical speed and psychological effect. Watson understood his remaining magazines would need to count, not just in targets engaged, but in battles that could be won or lost based on sustained fire capability. The platoon's advance resumed, but the landscape had fundamentally changed. Marines who'd previously sought long-range firing positions now moved aggressively toward enemy positions, using terrain features for concealment rather than establishing static defensive lines. Watson's demonstration had revealed that Japanese defensive tactics were vulnerable to direct assault by determined attackers who could maintain fire while advancing. The key was abandoning conventional wisdom that automatic weapons required fixed positions to be effective. As the platoon approached Hill 203's base, Watson counted his remaining ammunition, 10 magazines, 200 rounds total. The mathematics of automatic fire were unforgiving. At his demonstrated consumption rate, he possessed perhaps 10 more engagements before becoming simply another rifleman. But he'd learned something more valuable than ammunition conservation. The Japanese had prepared for conventional American assault, not for Marines who understood their most criticized weapon might be their most effective tool when used without regard for peacetime doctrine.
The mortar round that changed everything landed 23 yards behind Watson's position at 11:47 a.m. on February 27th. The explosion killed Corporal Henderson instantly and wounded 2 other Marines badly enough to remove them from the fight. More critically, it severed the communication wire connecting Watson's platoon to battalion headquarters, leaving 32 Marines isolated on a hilltop Japanese artillery had already registered for destruction. Watson found himself alone, not by choice, but by circumstance. The mortar barrage following Henderson's death scattered his squad across 100 yards of broken terrain, each Marine seeking whatever shelter the volcanic rock could provide. When the shelling stopped, an eerie quiet settled over the hill, the kind of silence preceding either retreat or annihilation. Through the sulfur-tinged air, Watson could see Japanese infantry moving through positions that should have been cleared hours earlier, reoccupying bunkers and cave mouths connecting to the tunnel system, honeycombing the island's interior. The tactical situation was worse than desperate Watson's platoon had advanced beyond supporting distance from other Marine units, drawn forward by what they'd believed was a breakthrough in Japanese defenses. Instead, they'd walked into a carefully planned trap. The enemy had allowed them to take the hill's crest, then sealed off retreat routes with coordinated fire from positions that had remained hidden during the initial assault. Now those same positions were revealing themselves, confident that isolated Marines posed no significant threat to their defensive network. Watson counted 7 distinct enemy positions within his field of view, each one carefully sighted to provide mutual support for the others. Japanese doctrine emphasized interlocking fields of fire that eliminated dead space and forced attackers into prepared killing zones. The positions were connected by tunnels, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened points or withdraw when under direct assault, only to reappear elsewhere in the network. Traditional Marine tactics based on identifying and destroying individual positions proved inadequate against an enemy who could disappear and reemerge at will. The first Japanese soldiers to approach Watson's position moved with the confidence of men who believed they faced a defeated enemy. A squad of 8 soldiers emerged from a tunnel entrance 40 yards down the slope. Type 99 rifles held ready, but not aimed with the urgency combat demanded. They'd been told the Americans on the hilltop were cut off and demoralized, waiting for either rescue or death. What they encountered instead was a Marine who'd spent 2 days learning that conventional tactics weren't merely inadequate, they were actively harmful in this new kind of warfare. Watson's opening burst caught the Japanese squad completely exposed in open ground. The bars' sustained fire swept across their formation like a scythe, the powerful .30-06 rounds proving devastatingly effective at close range. 8 enemy soldiers fell in under 5 seconds, their bodies scattered across terrain that moments before had seemed secure. But Watson understood this initial success was merely the beginning of a much larger engagement. The Japanese hadn't committed a single squad to retaking the hilltop. They'd committed an entire company, more than 120 soldiers who could afford casualties that would destroy a smaller force. The psychological impact of Watson's fire was as important as its physical effects. Japanese soldiers who'd been moving confidently toward what they believed was routine mop-up operations suddenly found themselves under sustained automatic fire from an enemy who should have been suppressed or eliminated. Their tactical doctrine hadn't prepared them for a single Marine who could maintain effective fire while constantly changing position. More critically, their officers hadn't anticipated an opponent who understood that mobility and aggression could overcome prepared defensive positions. Watson's next engagement occurred less than 2 minutes later when a second squad attempted flanking his position from the north. This time the enemy approached with greater caution, using volcanic outcroppings for cover and advancing by bounds. Their tactics were sound by conventional standards, but they hadn't adapted to facing an automatic weapon employed aggressively rather than defensively. Watson waited until the lead elements were committed to their assault, then moved directly toward them while firing sustained bursts that forced them into cover. The key to Watson's success lay in his abandonment of static defensive thinking. Instead of establishing a firing position and attempting to hold it against superior numbers, he treated the entire hilltop as a mobile battlefield where movement and fire were integrated into a single tactical concept. The bar's weight, previously a liability, now provided the stability necessary for accurate fire while advancing. Its automatic capability allowed him to maintain suppression without the pause required for bolt manipulation that characterized conventional rifles. Japanese return fire intensified as more enemy soldiers realized they faced a significant threat rather than isolated survivors. Rifle rounds and grenade fragments chipped volcanic rock around Watson's position, forcing him to time his movements carefully to avoid concentrated fire. But the enemy's response revealed a critical weakness in their tactical approach. They were attempting to engage a mobile target using techniques designed for static warfare. Their positions, while mutually supporting against conventional assault, became liabilities when facing an opponent who refused to remain in one location long enough to be effectively targeted. Watson's ammunition consumption during the first 10 minutes of sustained combat was enormous by conventional standards. He'd expended 4 20-round magazines, 80 rounds, representing more than 1/3 of his total load. But these calculations ignored the tactical value of sustained automatic fire against an enemy trained to expect aimed shots from bolt-action rifles. Each burst not only engaged visible targets but forced others to seek cover, disrupted their coordination, and created opportunities for further advances that would have been impossible under conventional rifle fire. The turning point came when Watson realized Japanese defensive positions were actually more vulnerable to close assault than to long-range engagement. Cave mouths and tunnel entrances that provided excellent protection against distant rifle fire became death traps when approached by an enemy with automatic weapons. The .30-06 cartridge retained lethal effectiveness even after ricocheting off volcanic rock, creating a cone of deadly fragments that reached into positions where direct fire couldn't penetrate. Watson's assault on the central bunker complex began at 12:05 and lasted exactly 4 minutes. Moving from position to position while maintaining continuous fire, he advanced across 60 yards of open ground that should have been impassable under enemy observation. His success depended not on superior marksmanship or tactical brilliance, but on his understanding that the BAR was fundamentally different from every other weapon on the battlefield. It wasn't a rifle that happened to fire automatically, but an automatic weapon that could be employed with rifle-like precision when necessary. The bunker that had anchored Japanese defenses on the hill contained 12 enemy soldiers and enough ammunition to sustain defensive fire for hours. Watson's approach eliminated that position in under 30 seconds of sustained automatic fire, the BAR's devastating close-range effectiveness proving overwhelming against defenders who'd prepared for a different kind of assault. When silence returned to the hilltop, Watson found himself surrounded by the results of 15 minutes that had redefined what one Marine with the right weapon could accomplish against impossible odds. The ammunition count told its own story. Watson had fired 160 rounds, leaving him with 80 rounds for whatever came next. But the tactical landscape had changed completely. Japanese positions that had seemed impregnable minutes earlier lay silent, their defenders either dead or withdrawn through tunnel systems that no longer provided the sanctuary they'd once offered. The too-heavy gun had proven that mobility and firepower, properly combined, could overcome any defensive position that depended on conventional tactical assumptions. The bullet that found Watson struck him in the left shoulder at 12:21, a 7.7 millimeter round from a Japanese sniper who'd been watching the hilltop through a scope for the better part of an hour. The impact spun Watson around and dropped him behind a cluster of volcanic rocks that had provided his last firing position. Blood soaked through his utility jacket, warm against skin that had grown cold from shock and adrenaline. For 30 seconds, the only sounds on the hill were his own labored breathing and the distant crack of rifle fire from other parts of the battlefield. The sniper's bullet should have ended Watson's fight, but it had struck at an angle that sent it through muscle and sinew without hitting bone or major arteries. Watson discovered this through careful inventory of his body's responses rather than any formal medical training. He could still move his arm, though each motion sent lightning through his nervous system. More importantly, he could still operate the BAR's controls, even if reloading would require adaptations to accommodate his wounded shoulder. The weapon itself had survived the fall undamaged, its robust construction proving as reliable as its reputation suggested. Japanese voices echoed from positions down the slope, discussing tactical options in tones suggesting confidence rather than desperation. They'd witnessed Watson's assault on their defensive positions and understood they faced an exceptional opponent, but they also knew wounded men had limitations that could be exploited through patient tactics. The sniper had done his job by wounding rather than killing. A wounded Marine might attempt to hold his position, creating opportunities for coordinated assault that a dead enemy couldn't provide. Watson's ammunition situation had become critical in ways extending beyond simple round counts. He possessed exactly 60 cartridges in 3 magazines, enough for perhaps 3 minutes of sustained combat at his previous consumption rate, but more significantly, his wounded shoulder would prevent the rapid magazine changes automatic fire demanded. Each reload would require 15 to 20 seconds rather than the 8 seconds he'd managed when unwounded. In a close-range firefight against multiple opponents, those additional seconds could prove fatal. The tactical problem facing Watson was unlike anything covered in Marine Corps training manuals. Military doctrine assumed wounded personnel would be evacuated or would seek defensive positions until medical aid arrived. Neither option existed on his isolated hilltop. Evacuation required communication with supporting units, which had been severed by mortar fire hours earlier. Defensive positions required mutual support from other Marines who'd been scattered across terrain that made coordination impossible. Watson faced the choice between retreat and continued aggression, with either option carrying nearly certain consequences. The decision was made for him when Japanese infantry began moving up the slope in coordinated bounds, their approach suggesting a platoon-strength assault designed to overwhelm his position through concentrated fire and maneuver. Watson counted at least 20 soldiers in the initial wave, with more following through terrain features that concealed their actual numbers. They moved with the disciplined patience of troops who understood time favored their cause. A wounded enemy with limited ammunition couldn't sustain defensive fire indefinitely. Watson's response violated every principle of defensive warfare taught in military schools. Instead of seeking cover and attempting to establish interlocking fields of fire, he moved toward the advancing enemy while firing controlled bursts that forced them to ground. His wounded shoulder created an awkward firing stance that actually improved his accuracy by limiting his tendency to spray rounds across wide target areas. Each burst was more carefully aimed than his previous automatic fire, with devastating results against enemy soldiers who hadn't expected aggressive action from a wounded opponent. The Japanese assault faltered within minutes as soldiers trained for conventional tactics found themselves facing an enemy who refused to behave according to established patterns. Their doctrine called for suppressing defensive positions with concentrated fire while assault elements maneuvered for close combat. But Watson's position changed constantly, making suppression impossible and rendering their carefully rehearsed assault techniques useless. More critically, his automatic fire created casualty rates exceeding what their tactical planning had anticipated. Watson's wound became a tactical advantage in unexpected ways. The pain forced him to move more deliberately, eliminating the rushed decisions that had characterized his earlier engagements. Each position change was calculated to maximize cover while maintaining fields of fire covering likely enemy approaches. His reduced physical capacity required more efficient ammunition use, leading to shot placement that was actually more effective than his previous sustained bursts. The limitation became liberation from wasteful tactics he hadn't realized he was employing. The second wound came at 12:38 when a grenade fragment opened a gash along Watson's left leg. The explosion had been intended to flush him from cover, but instead provided confirmation that the enemy knew his general location while remaining uncertain about his exact position. Watson used this knowledge to create deception, firing from one location, then immediately moving to another before return fire could be effectively directed. His blood trail, visible on the dark volcanic rock, actually assisted this deception by suggesting wounds more severe than reality. Japanese casualties mounted steadily as their assault continued. Watson's accurate fire had eliminated at least 15 enemy soldiers, reducing their numerical advantage while creating psychological pressure affecting tactical decisions. Officers who'd planned a methodical reduction of his position found themselves committing reserves to maintain assault momentum. The result was escalating commitment that transformed a routine operation into a desperate struggle for control of terrain, holding no strategic value beyond the symbolism of defeating one American Marine. The critical moment arrived when Watson's ammunition reached its final magazine. 20 rounds represented perhaps 90 seconds of combat capability, after which he would become simply another wounded Marine awaiting either rescue or death. But those 20 rounds also represented the culmination of everything he'd learned about employing automatic weapons in close combat. Each cartridge would be fired with the precision of a sniper combined with the tactical mobility that had made his previous actions successful. The Japanese commander's final assault committed every available soldier to simultaneous attack from multiple directions. Watson counted 37 enemy troops converging on his position, their coordination suggesting excellent training and leadership under conventional circumstances. Such numbers would guarantee tactical success against a single wounded defender. But these weren't conventional circumstances, and Watson was no longer fighting as a conventional Marine. He was fighting as a man who understood his weapon's true potential could only be realized when employed without regard for doctrinal limitations. Watson's last stand lasted exactly 3 minutes and 17 seconds. Moving constantly while firing controlled bursts, he engaged targets that appeared briefly before disappearing into the volcanic terrain. His wounded condition forced economy of motion that actually improved his effectiveness, each shot carefully planned and executed with precision his earlier automatic fire had lacked. When his final round was expended at 12:44, the hilltop held only silence and the evidence of what one Marine with the right weapon could accomplish when pushed beyond every limitation training had imposed. The battlefield assessment conducted hours later by advancing Marine units would record 60 Japanese casualties in the immediate area around Watson's position. The count included soldiers who'd been wounded and withdrawn through tunnel systems, making exact numbers impossible to determine. What could be measured precisely was the tactical impact. An entire company of experienced Japanese infantry had been neutralized by a single wounded Marine whose weapon was considered obsolete by military planners who'd never faced the reality of close-range automatic fire employed aggressively rather than defensively. The stretcher-bearers who reached Watson at 2:35 p.m. found him conscious but barely coherent, his blood loss severe enough to require immediate evacuation to the hospital ship offshore. His left shoulder had been shattered by the sniper bullet, requiring surgery that would take place under conditions far removed from sterile stateside operating rooms. The grenade fragment in his leg had severed muscle tissue, but missed major arteries, a piece of fortune that probably saved his life during the 3 hours he'd held the hilltop alone. Lieutenant Colonel Denig arrived at the aid station 20 minutes after Watson's evacuation, carrying field reports that painted an incomplete picture of what had occurred on Hill. 203 radio communications had been severed for most of the engagement, leaving battalion headquarters to piece together events from testimony of scattered Marines who'd witnessed portions of the action from distant positions. The physical evidence spoke more clearly than witness statements. 60 confirmed Japanese casualties in an area roughly 100 yards square, with weapons and equipment suggesting an entire company had been committed to the assault. The Browning automatic rifle lay where Watson had dropped it, its barrel still warm despite the hours that had passed since his final shots. Ordnance specialists who examined the weapon found it mechanically perfect. With no signs of the overheating or mechanical failure, automatic weapons were expected to suffer during sustained combat. The barrel showed normal wear patterns, the action cycled smoothly, and the magazine well retained the precise tolerances that allowed reliable feeding under combat conditions. Most significantly, the weapon showed no evidence of the modifications or field expedients Marines typically employed to improve reliability in Pacific conditions. Watson's ammunition expenditure became the subject of detailed analysis by Marine Corps intelligence officers seeking to understand how conventional small arms doctrine had proven so inadequate against Japanese defensive tactics. Field counts suggested Watson had fired approximately 200 rounds during his 15-minute engagement, representing nearly 90% of his total load. By conventional standards, such consumption rates were unsustainable and tactically irresponsible. By the standards Watson had established, they represented the minimum firepower necessary to neutralize a well-prepared enemy position through aggressive assault rather than methodical reduction. The tactical implications extended far beyond a single engagement on a volcanic island in the Pacific. Marine Corps planners had based their small arms doctrine on European experience, where automatic weapons were employed primarily in defensive roles or as support weapons for advancing infantry. Watson had demonstrated the same weapons could be decisive when employed aggressively at close range, but only when operators abandoned conventional thinking about ammunition conservation and positional stability. The lesson was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. Automatic weapons reached their full potential only when used without regard for peacetime limitations. Captain Morrison, the battalion intelligence officer, spent 3 days interviewing Marines who'd observed portions of Watson's action from supporting positions. Their accounts described a style of combat bearing little resemblance to approved Marine Corps tactics, but proving devastatingly effective against an enemy prepared for conventional assault. Morrison's report, filed on March 2nd, recommended fundamental changes in how automatic weapons were employed by Marine infantry, with particular emphasis on close-range tactics that maximized firepower at the expense of ammunition conservation. The medical report on Watson's condition revealed wounds that should have been fatal under conventional combat circumstances. His shoulder injury had severed muscles necessary for accurate rifle fire, while his leg wound had reduced his mobility to the point where normal tactical movement became impossible. Yet he'd continued fighting for more than 3 hours after receiving these wounds, adapting his tactics to accommodate physical limitations that would have rendered most Marines' combat ineffective. The adaptation had actually improved his tactical effectiveness by forcing more deliberate shot placement and more efficient use of available cover. Watson's evacuation to the hospital ship offshore took place during continuing combat operations that would consume another month before Iwo Jima was declared secure. His individual action represented less than 1% of the total casualties inflicted during the battle. Yet his tactical innovations influenced Marine Corps doctrine for the remainder of the Pacific War units, equipped with Browning automatic rifles, began employing them aggressively rather than defensively, with results that vindicated Watson's instinctive understanding of the weapon's true capabilities. The Medal of Honor recommendation prepared by Lieutenant Colonel Denig on March 5th described Watson's actions in language emphasizing courage and determination, While understating the tactical innovations that had made his success possible, military decorations traditionally recognize bravery rather than tactical brilliance, leaving the doctrinal implications of Watson's performance to be addressed through separate channels. The citation credited him with single-handedly neutralizing an enemy company, language that was factually accurate but failed to convey the broader significance of his tactical approach. Watson's recovery aboard the hospital ship took 6 weeks, during which time he remained largely unaware of the analytical attention his action had generated within Marine Corps headquarters. His primary concern was physical rehabilitation that would allow him to return to his unit, though medical officers had already determined his wounds would require evacuation to stateside hospitals. The war would continue without him, but his contribution would influence how it was fought by thousands of Marines who would never know his name. The Browning automatic rifle's reputation within the Marine Corps underwent fundamental revision during the final year of the Pacific War. Weapons previously considered too heavy for aggressive infantry tactics were redistributed to Marines trained in the close assault techniques Watson had developed through desperate improvisation. Training programs began emphasizing mobility and firepower over the positional tactics that had dominated pre-war doctrine. Most importantly, ammunition allocation for automatic weapons was increased to reflect the reality that sustained fire capability was more valuable than conservation in close-range combat. The Pacific Theater's unique tactical requirements had created conditions where conventional military wisdom proved inadequate, forcing individual Marines to develop solutions that contradicted established doctrine. Watson's success represented the intersection of desperate circumstances, innovative thinking, and a weapon system that had never been employed according to its true capabilities.
His 15 minutes on Hill 203 demonstrated that the most criticized equipment could become the most decisive when used by someone who understood that survival required abandoning preconceptions about how warfare was supposed to be conducted. The final irony of Watson's story lay in the timing of his tactical breakthrough. By March 1945, military planners had already begun phasing out the Browning automatic rifle in favor of lighter, more conventional weapons that reflected peacetime assumptions about infantry combat. Watson had proven the weapon's effectiveness, just as the military establishment had decided it was obsolete, leaving future generations of soldiers to rediscover tactical principles that one wounded Marine had learned through desperate necessity on a hilltop in the Pacific. The too-heavy gun that had saved his life would soon disappear from American arsenals, its true potential realized too late to influence the doctrinal changes that might have saved thousands of other lives in the brutal island campaigns that defined the Pacific War.
If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to stay connected with history that matters. These stories shape the world we live in today, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from. Our community reaches across continents, connecting people who understand that history isn't just dates and names in textbooks. History is people making choices, taking risks, doing difficult things because they believed it mattered. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering.